The air in the tack house was stagnant, heavy with the kind of silence that precedes a storm. Mariah Copeland sat on the edge of the worn leather sofa, a single sheet of paper trembling in her hand. The Newman and Copeland families had weathered scandals, resurrections, and corporate wars, but the sequence of jagged data points on the page before her felt different. It felt like an erasure. "It doesn't make sense," Mariah whispered, her voice cracking. It says, I'm not who we think I am." Sharon Rosales stood by the fireplace, her knuckles white as she gripped the mantel. She looked at Nick Newman, who was pacing the length of the room, his brow furrowed in that familiar, protective scowl. "That test is garbage, Mariah," Nick said, stopping abruptly. "We know who you are. We lived through the hell of finding you. Cassie, the twin connection. This is a mistake, a lab error." "Is it?" Mariah looked up, her eyes rimmed with red, the dark circles beneath them speaking to weeks of sleepless nights. "Or is it the reason I've felt so unmoored lately? Like I don't fit in my own skin, let alone this family." The document in her hand, a genetic ancestry report she hadn't even remembered requesting, one that had arrived in a plain, unmarked envelope, claimed 0 biological markers, shared with Sharon. It was an impossibility, a scientific contradiction to the history they had forged in blood and tears. Yet, in her fragile state, recovering from her recent psychological break, the paper carried the weight of a gavel strike. "Let me see it again," Sharon said, moving to sit beside her daughter. She took the paper, scanning the clinical font. "This isn't from the hospital lab. There's no letterhead, Mariah. This was sent to hurt you." "But the details, Mom," Mariah choked out, the word mom sounding foreign on her tongue. "It lists markers from a lineage in Oregon. A specific town where the cult used to operate." The mention of the cult sucked the oxygen out of the room. Nick exchanged a dark look with Sharon. The shadow of the past was never far behind them in Genoa City. By the following afternoon, the seeds of doubt had sprouted into a tangle of paranoia. Sharon and Nick had taken the document to a private specialist at Memorial, hoping for a quick dismissal. Instead, they found roadblocks. Files from Mariah's original paternity test were missing from the hospital archives. The digital records of her birth, those scant few that existed, had been corrupted. "It's a hack," Nick growled, slamming his phone down on the table at crimson lights. "Someone is scrubbing the history. They want us to doubt. They want her to doubt." Sharon stared into her coffee, the steam rising in lazy swirls. "It's working, Nick. She wouldn't answer my calls this morning. She told Tessa she needed space. She's isolating herself, just like she did when she didn't finish the sentence. When Ian Ward had her." "We need help," Nick said, his voice low. "Real help. The kind that doesn't play by the rules." "You mean Victor," Sharon said, the name landing with a thud. "I mean my father, and Adam." Across town, in the sleek, glass-walled office of Newman Media, the atmosphere was charged with a different kind of electricity. Victor Newman sat behind his desk, his silhouette imposing against the skyline. Adam Newman stood opposite him, arms crossed, a look of weary skepticism on his face. "You want me to divert resources from the McCall acquisition to track down a ghost?" Adam asked. "I want you to protect this family, Adam," Victor replied, his voice a low rumble. "Someone is targeting Mariah. And by extension, Sharon. I do not like coincidences. The missing files, the fabricated DNA results, this is a psychological assault. And you think I'm the best person to recognize a gaslighting campaign?" Adam smirked, though there was no humor in it. "I think you possess a certain familiarity with the darker impulses of the human mind," Victor said, his eyes narrowing. "You and I have our differences, son, but we both know that when an enemy strikes at the mind, they are trying to dismantle the soul. We find out who sent that envelope, now." Adam hesitated, then nodded. "I'll run a trace on the courier service that delivered it." "But Victor, if this is who I think it is, we aren't dealing with a corporate rival." "I know," Victor said, turning his chair to face the window. "We are dealing with a monster." The chaos deepened as the week wore on. False leads began to pop up like landmines. A witness appeared at the athletic club, claiming to be a nurse who swapped babies decades ago, only to vanish before the police arrived. A blog post surfaced, detailing the great Newman lie, spinning a narrative that Sharon had faked the twin discovery to keep Nick close. It was a symphony of gaslighting, and Mariah was the conductor's sole audience. She sat in a motel room on the outskirts of town, the curtains drawn. She had left the tack house, unable to bear the pity in Sharon's eyes. Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw a stranger. The phone on the knit-stand buzzed incessantly. Tessa, Sharon, Kyle, but she ignored them all. Then, a text came through from an unknown number. "They are lying to you. Come to the abandoned warehouse on River Road. Learn the truth about your creation." Mariah grabbed her coat. She felt like a marionette, her strings pulled by invisible hands. The warehouse was a cavern of rusting steel and dripping water. The wind howled through broken windows, sounding like human cries. Mariah stepped into the center of the floor, her flashlight cutting a weak beam through the gloom. "Hello," she called out. "I'm here. Tell me the truth." "The truth is a fluid concept, my dear," a voice echoed from the shadows. It was smooth, cultured, and terrifyingly familiar. Mariah froze, her breath hitched in her throat. "No, you're dead. Victor shot you." "I am merely persistent," the voice purred. From behind a stack of shipping crates, a figure emerged. He was older, his hair thinner, but the eyes were the same cold, predatory chips of ice. Ian Ward. He smiled, a gesture that didn't reach his eyes. "You look well, Mariah, or should I say, Subject 7. "Stop it." Mariah backed away, her hands trembling. "Why are you doing this?" "The DNA test, the missing files. All part of the lesson," Ian said, stepping closer. "You see, these people, the Newmans, your mother, they collect strays. They polish you up, put you in designer clothes, and pretend you belong. But you and I know the truth. You are a product of chaos. You belong to the darkness." "I belong to myself," Mariah screamed, though her resolve was crumbling. The psychological weight of the last few days, the doubt about her biology, the isolation had cracked her armor. Ian had found the fissure and was prying it open. "Do you?" Ian laughed softly. "Then why are you here, alone, instead of in the arms of that family you cherish so much?" "Because deep down, you know you are poison to them, just like I taught you." Outside, the roar of an engine cut through the night. Tires screeched on the gravel. The heavy metal doors of the warehouse groaned as they were forced open. "Mariah!" It was Nick. Beside him stood Sharon, and flanking them were Victor and Adam. The family, fractured and fighting amongst themselves only days ago, stood shoulder to shoulder, a phalanx of Newman resolve. Ian Ward stopped, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second before returning, wider and more manic. "Ah, the cavalry, how touching, and how predictable." "It's over, Ian," Victor barked, stepping forward, his cane hitting the concrete with a decisive clack. "We traced the courier. We found your digital footprint. You're sloppy or theatrical." Ian spread his arms wide. "Look at her, Victor. Look at the doubt in her eyes. I've already won. I've proven that her bond with you people is as fragile as paper." "Mariah, listen to me," Sharon called out. Ignoring Ian, she stepped past Victor, walking straight toward the man who had tormented her for years. "Don't listen to a word he says. He fabricated that test. He planted those lies. You are my daughter. I felt it the moment I saw you. And I feel it now. DNA doesn't make us family, love does. And he doesn't know the first thing about that." Mariah looked between Sharon and Ian, the man who represented her trauma, and the woman who represented her healing. Ian's eyes bored into her, willing her to break, to run, to destroy herself as he had intended. "He says I'm poison," Mariah whispered, tears spilling over. "He's projecting," Adam said, his voice calm, cutting through the emotional haze. He moved to stand beside Sharon. "He's the one who destroys everything he touches. You built a life, Mariah. You built a family. He's just a ghost haunting a graveyard he dug for himself." Ian sneered, his composure snapping. "You arrogant Newmans, you think you can just write checks and make the past disappear. I wanted to watch you tear each other apart. I wanted you to feel the void. The only void here is you," Nick said, his fists clenched. Ian reached into his jacket, and for a heartbeat, the air froze. Victor didn't flinch. "Go ahead, Ian, give me a reason." Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Ian's expression shifted from malice to self-preservation. He looked at the back exit, then at Mariah. "This isn't over, Mariah," he hissed. "The seed is planted." He bolted for the shadows, but Adam was faster. He tackled Ian into a pile of old pallets, the two men grappling in the dust. Nick rushed in, pulling Ian off his brother and pinning him to the ground. Mariah stood frozen, shaking violently. Sharon reached her, wrapping her arms around her daughter, pulling her into a fierce embrace. "I've got you. I've got you. It wasn't real." Mariah sobbed into Sharon's shoulder. "The test. None of it," Sharon promised. "Just him. Just his hate." Hours later, the warehouse was a crime scene, bathed in the flashing blue and red lights of the GCPD. Ian Ward was in handcuffs, shouting biblical nonsense as he was shoved into a cruiser. The Newman family stood by the parked cars. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a deep exhaustion. Victor approached Sharon and Mariah. He looked at his granddaughter, a term he used sparingly, but meant fiercely. "You are a Newman, Mariah. Never forget that. Newmans do not break." Mariah looked at the old man, then at Adam, who was dusting off his jacket, and Nick, who was checking his knuckles. Finally, she looked at Sharon. "I'm sorry I doubted you," Mariah said softly. "Don't be," Sharon said, brushing a stray hair from Mariah's face. "He knew exactly where to hit us, but we're still standing." As they got into their cars to head back to the ranch, the lights of Genoa City twinkled in the distance, indifferent to the drama. The trust had been tested, the foundation shaken, but as the convoy of cars moved together down the dark highway, the cracks began to seal, bound by the only thing that truly mattered in this town: survival. The latest wave of chaos sweeping through Genoa City promises to give fans exactly the kind of emotional wreckage they both dread and crave. As they watched the total breakdown of Kane Ashby play out side by side with Mariah Copeland's arrest and Claire Newman's ruthless victory over Audra Charles. It is one of those weeks where everything seems to crumble at once, where personal collapses and corporate warfare intertwine so tightly that no one can quite tell where the business ends and the emotional damage begins. At the heart of it all is Sharon Newman, moving through her days with a crushing sense of guilt she cannot shake. Haunted by the realization that she saw Mariah struggling, but somehow never managed to get her the help she truly needed. Every headline about Mariah's crimes, every whisper in the coffee shop, every sideways glance from people who once admired her, lands on Sharon like another accusation. In her mind, it doesn't matter how many people tell her this isn't her fault. She replays every warning sign, every moment when Mariah seemed just a little too fragile, a little too obsessive, a little too lost. What if she had pushed harder for therapy, or insisted on treatment, or refused to let Mariah hide behind humor and faux toughness? What if she had taken that uneasy feeling in her gut more seriously? Sharon's guilt becomes a constant narrator in her head, telling her that Mariah didn't just fall apart in a vacuum, she fell apart on her watch. And because this is Sharon, she doesn't just blame herself quietly. She carries that guilt into every interaction, trying to advocate for compassion and understanding for Mariah even as the town begins to turn on her. As if defending her daughter might somehow undo the catastrophe that has already unfolded. For Mariah, meanwhile, everything narrows to a single desperate objective: get out of the United States with Dominic Winters before someone can drag reality back into the picture. The plan, in its earliest form, is rash but clear: leave Genoa City, leave the country, cross a border and disappear into some anonymous corner of the world where no one knows who Dominic is, where no one can call him by any name but Bowie, where no legal documents or court orders can reach them. In Mariah's fractured mind, this isn't a kidnapping anymore. It's a rescue mission, a chance to rewrite destiny before it is locked in by people who, she is increasingly convinced, don't understand what Dominic truly needs. But plans made in panic rarely survive contact with the real world. As she moves forward, trying to execute her escape, small obstacles begin to pile up: questions at the airport, inconsistencies in paperwork. The kind of small logistical snags that might not bother a stable person but send someone in Mariah's state spiraling. On the road, or at some midpoint in her journey, she is jolted by a new complication, something that forces her to change direction and abandon the original route entirely. Perhaps it is the realization that someone is onto her, or a sudden shift in Dominic's condition, or a flare of conscience that attacks her at the worst possible moment. Whatever it is, her carefully clung to fantasy of a clean, decisive escape unravels, and she is forced into improvisation, a dangerous place for someone already teetering on the edge. At the exact same time, Devin and Abby Winters are no longer sitting helplessly at home. With the help of Detective Burrow, a man who combines methodical investigation with a quiet empathy for how close to the edge these parents are, they piece together a new lead. One that finally has traction. It is no longer speculation or vague hope, it is a concrete path, a trail that can actually be followed. When Detective Burrow lays out the evidence, travel records, sightings, financial activity, Devon and Abby barely need to discuss it. They move as one, boarding a plane with a kind of hollow determination, knowing that whatever they find on the other side will change their lives again, whether Dominic is in Mariah's arms, alone, or already out of reach. The flight becomes its own emotional crucible, a suspended moment where they are trapped above the world, with nothing to do but imagine every possible outcome and silently wonder how much more their family can endure before something inside them breaks for good. While this devastating chase plays out over skies and borders, Kane Ashby's story spirals downward on an entirely different battlefield. Though the sense of powerlessness and desperation is eerily similar, Kane has been clinging to a fragile hope that if he can just convince the Newman faction to return to Victor Newman's side, if he can broker some kind of uneasy truce and bring Newman's power back. Under Victor's control, then, he can secure freedom and safety for his own family. To Kane, this is not abstract corporate maneuvering, it is survival. Every pitch he makes, every late-night strategy session, is driven by a father and husband's determination to shield his loved ones from the fallout of a war that has already drawn them in too deeply. He is gambling his pride, his moral comfort, and his stability on the idea that Victor's favor can still be his shield, but he is not operating in a vacuum. Phyllis Summers and Billy Abbott, to people who have danced on the edge of destruction more times than anyone can count, are quietly orchestrating their own agenda behind his back. They see Kane's efforts to pull Newman back into Victor's camp not as a noble attempt at peace, but as an opportunity, a moment of vulnerability they can exploit to seize control of Newman Enterprises for themselves. While Kane is exhausting himself trying to meet Victor's expectations, praying that loyalty and sacrifice will translate into protection, Phyllis and Billy are moving pieces he doesn't even realize are on the board. Their coordination is as cold as it is effective, undercutting Kane's arguments, poisoning trust in his reliability, subtly positioning him as weak and overwhelmed while they present themselves as the bold, decisive alternative. Every time he thinks he has finally made progress, some invisible hand moves the finish line farther away. The cruelty of it all is that Kane truly believes he can still fix this if he just pushes a little harder, if he just finds the right words, the right leverage, the right promise. He imagines a scenario where Victor nods, extends his hand, and brings Newman Enterprises back under his own iron grip, securing a measure of stability that trickles down to protect Kane's family. But the reality is that while he is burning himself out trying to reclaim control on Victor's behalf, Phyllis and Billy are busy consolidating their own. They are not content to simply block Kane's efforts, they intend to win. The more Kane fails, the more he doubts himself, and the more that doubt shows, the easier it becomes for others to sideline him. Fans will watch as the weight of failure, fear, and betrayal finally crushes Kane's composure. The cracks that have been forming for weeks or months deepen into a full collapse, his confidence shattered, his alliances compromised, his illusions about loyalty and gratitude burned away. He stands in the ruins of everything he thought he could control, faced with the brutal truth that while he was trying to play peacemaker, Phyllis and Billy were always playing conqueror. And in that bleak symmetry, Genoa City finds itself mirroring the same pattern again and again. People like Mariah and Kane, chasing security and love with desperate, reckless choices, while sharper, colder operators move behind them, turning their crises into opportunities. Mariah is led away in handcuffs, her mind still clinging to the belief that she loved Dominic more fiercely than anyone understood. Kane is left staring at a corporate landscape that no longer has a place for him, his family's safety more uncertain than ever. Claire Newman emerges victorious over Audra Charles, another power shift in a town where dominance is always fleeting. Sharon Newman watches it all with that familiar ache in her chest, knowing that her failures and her love are now forever entangled. Devon and Abby step off their plane into a confrontation that will decide the future of their son. And above all of it, Newman Enterprises, once the uncheckable symbol of Victor's reign, stands as a prize that the next generation is willing to poison, betray, and destroy each other to claim. No matter how many lives are crushed in the process. Adam Newman was used to walking into rooms where the air was already thick with secrets. But even he was not prepared for the sight that greeted him when he stepped into the private train car and saw Kane Ashby sprawled unconscious at Victor's feet. The rhythmic hum of the tracks should have made everything feel calm, lulling, controlled, but instead it only underscored how wrong the scene looked. Like a soundtrack to a disaster that had already happened before anyone thought to hit stop. Kane's body was limp in a way that did not look like simple exhaustion, and Victor stood over him with that maddeningly composed expression that always sat somewhere between concern and calculation. For a brief moment Adam just stared, experiencing that uneasy flicker of recognition that came from being too familiar with moments where someone had clearly gone too far. Where a plan had crossed an unseen line. Questions rose in his mind faster than he could sort them. What had happened before he arrived? Why was Victor not shouting for help, not demanding a doctor, not ordering someone to call emergency services on standby? Instead, his father seemed almost as if he had been expecting this, as though Kane collapsing at his feet was another move in a game only he knew how to play. Adam felt that familiar, cold knot in his chest tighten. He wanted answers, and not the carefully curated version Victor was so good at dispensing. He wanted the truth about how a man who was supposed to be working to get back into Victor's good graces had ended up unconscious on a Newman-controlled train, and whether this was an accident, a miscalculation, or something far more deliberate that no one was supposed to dig too deeply into. While Adam stood in the shadow of that tableau, already running through possibilities and reading every micro-expression on Victor's face, another Newman crisis was unfolding back in Genoa City. One of those slow-burning emotional disasters that begin with nothing more than an embrace that lasts a few seconds too long. Nikki Newman, once again overwhelmed by the swirl of chaos around her family, found herself seeking comfort in a place that had so often felt like a refuge, Jack Abbott. The two shared a history layered with mistakes, tenderness, attraction, and mutual understanding, and when Nikki felt the walls closing in, she gravitated toward the one person who seemed to see her not just as Victor's wife or the Newman matriarch, but as a human being who still carried old wounds and fresh doubts. Their conversation started innocently enough, a shared glass, a few softly spoken confessions, the kind of quiet intimacy that does not require grand declarations. But pain has a way of eroding boundaries, and instinctively Nikki leaned in closer, Jack's arms closing around her in an embrace that felt more like an anchor than a comfort. It was intense, honest, and completely misinterpretable, especially by a woman like Diane Jenkins Abbott, who walked in at precisely the wrong moment and saw not context, not nuance, but threat. From the doorway, Diane's eyes locked onto the sight of her husband holding another woman in a way that looked nothing like a casual hug between old friends. To her, it looked like a line being crossed, a test of loyalty she had not agreed to. The look that flashed across her face was not just jealousy, but a deeper, more wounded anger. The kind that emerges when someone who has clawed their way back to respectability feels it being snatched away by an old pattern trying to repeat itself. She would call it a question of boundaries, of propriety, of self-respect. But underneath all of that was fear that Jack was still vulnerable to Nikki's orbit, and that Diane's place in his life was not nearly as secure as she wanted the world to believe. Far from this emotionally charged triangle, Los Angeles became the stage for a quieter but equally dangerous kind of deception as Claire Newman stepped into a role that required her to filter every word she spoke through a sieve of strategy. In the sprawling, glittering sprawl of LA, where reinvention is practically currency, Claire set about investigating the disappearance of an art dealer whose absence had begun to raise questions in the wrong circles. Holden Novak, a man who perhaps believed he had a clearer understanding of Claire's intentions than he truly did, found himself on the periphery of her movements, trying to read her, trying to help, or at the very least trying to keep up. But Claire's mission required secrecy, and the stakes of the missing dealer's case were not something she was willing to risk by being fully honest. Not even with someone who thought he deserved to be in her confidence. So she lied. Not with wild, theatrical fabrications, but with carefully constructed omissions and half-truths that allowed her to keep Holden close enough to be useful without ever fully tipping her hand. When he asked questions, she redirected. When he sensed something was wrong, she offered just enough explanation to soothe him without satisfying his curiosity. As she dug deeper into the art world's underbelly, tracing where paintings and people had gone missing, Claire's dual performance investigator and manipulator became more difficult to sustain. Each step she took toward the truth about the dealer's disappearance tied her tighter into knots of secrecy that would inevitably demand a reckoning once Holden realized how thoroughly he had been kept in the dark. It was in this same city, drenched in neon and expectation, that Noah Newman arrived with his own agenda. One that had nothing to do with missing art dealers and everything to do with unfinished business of the heart. Noah's destination was not a gallery or a police office, but Sienna Bacall, the woman he was convinced he still belonged with despite distance, tension, and whatever emotional landmines lay buried between them. He stepped into Los Angeles with the single-minded determination of a man who had convinced himself that fate had made a mistake and that it was his job to correct it. Every part of his plan revolved around the idea of persuasion. If he could just find the right words, the right moment, the right gesture, he could make Sienna see what he saw so clearly. That they were supposed to be together, that whatever had pulled them apart was temporary compared to the pull between them. In his mind, it was romantic, noble even, this idea of flying across states to fight for a love that had slipped through his fingers. But as he sought Sienna out, trying to break through whatever defenses she had built up since they parted, Noah had to confront the uncomfortable truth that determination can easily slide into pressure, that what he believed to be grand devotion might look to Sienna like refusal to accept her boundaries. Los Angeles became a mirror for both of them, reflecting not just what might be, but everything that had gone wrong before. Back in Genoa City, where trains hummed and corporate war simmered, another kind of performance was unfolding as Valentine's Day approached. Adam Newman, despite his tangled history with almost everyone in town, decided to lean into something softer, something surprisingly vulnerable, as he prepared a romantic gesture for Chelsea Lawson. Their relationship had been through so many iterations, enemies, allies, lovers, co-parents, that it would have been easy to write them off as permanently stuck in a cycle of almosts and what-ifs. But Adam, in a rare moment of clarity, recognized that beneath all the damage, there was still a connection between them that could not be fully severed. So instead of choosing transactional or grandstanding moves, he opted for something personal. Something that reminded Chelsea of who they were when the world fell away, and it was just the two of them and their son. He planned a Valentine's surprise that was not about impressing anyone else, but about showing her that he saw her, really saw her, not just as a co-parent or a former lover, but as a woman he still cared about in a way that mattered. When Chelsea was confronted with the gesture, whatever form it took, whether a carefully chosen memory, a private setting echoing a happier time, or a tangible expression of his understanding of her, she was caught off guard. It was difficult to reconcile the Adam who had made so many destructive choices with the man standing in front of her, trying, in his halting, imperfect way, to offer something good. For a moment, Valentine's Day stopped being an empty marker on the calendar and became a question. Could they honor what was still between them without reopening all the wounds that had never fully healed? Elsewhere in town, another couple was teetering on the edge of decision as Billy Abbott tried to convince Sally Spectra that their story was not as over as it looked. Billy, ever the charming risk-taker with a self-sabotaging streak, had crossed a line in his dealings with Phyllis Summers, resorting to what Sally and others could only describe as dirty tactics. It was the kind of move that might have once seemed like just another notch in his long history of bad decisions, but this time, the fallout was different. Sally, who had built her identity around her resilience and refusal to be anyone's fool, found herself staring at a man who wanted her to believe that his love was real even when his actions undercut any trust she might have had left. Billy insisted that they could still be a couple, that whatever he had done in the shadows with Phyllis did not erase what they had, that he was capable of change, capable of choosing her, and only her. But for Sally, the calculus was no longer as simple as whether she still had feelings for him. The question had become whether those feelings were strong enough to justify aligning herself with someone who kept proving that his instincts pulled him toward chaos and questionable alliances. As Billy made his case, trying to remind her of their chemistry, their shared ambitions, the ways they had once made each other feel alive, Sally weighed the past and present with cold precision. She knew the details of his scheme against Phyllis, knew how far he had gone, knew that his actions had not just been reactive, but intentional. She had to ask herself whether forgiving him would mean condoning that part of him, the part that could turn on someone he claimed to care about when it suited him. If he could do that to Phyllis, How long before he did something similar to her the next time he felt cornered or insecure? Maybe he was right that they could still be a couple. Maybe their connection was strong enough to survive one more betrayal. Or maybe this was the moment when Sally's refusal to compromise on her own sense of worth would finally drive a permanent wedge between them. As she looked at Billy, at the earnestness in his eyes and the desperation behind it, she realized that whatever she chose would not just define their relationship. It would define who she was willing to be in this town, surrounded by people who so often confused love with a willingness to endure damage. And so, in a single stretch of days, fans are positioned to watch everything unravel and realign at once. Adam's sharp instincts are triggered by the sight of Kane unconscious in front of Victor on that train, pushing him once again into the role of the son who asks the questions no one else dares speak aloud. Nikki's need for comfort leads her into Jack's arms at exactly the worst possible moment, forcing Diane to confront her deepest insecurities about her marriage. Claire spins lies for Holden while hunting for a truth in Los Angeles that might shatter more than just one missing art dealer's reputation. Noah chases Sienna with a heart full of conviction, not realizing that love alone might not be enough to bridge the gap time and pain have carved between them. Adam's Valentine's surprise catches Chelsea between nostalgia and self-preservation. Billy's pleas put Sally in the impossible position of choosing between forgiving yet another betrayal or finally cutting ties for good. Under all of it runs a single, relentless question that the weak refuses to answer too quickly. In a world like Genoa City, where love, loyalty, and ambition are constantly colliding, how many second chances can people give each other before they finally admit that someone has gone too far to ever come back? Even though Mariah has been clinging to the fantasy that she can simply vanish with Dominic and raise him as her own, building a life where no one calls him anything but Bowie, and no one ever dares to question her version of motherhood, that dream is already crumbling before it ever has a chance to solidify. And somewhere deep down, she has to know it, even if she refuses to admit it to herself. Every mile she tried to put between herself and Genoa City, every rushed plan, every anxious glance over her shoulder was always doomed by the simple reality that she was not the only one who loved this child. That there were parents on the other side of the chase who would never stop searching, never stop hunting, never stop tearing the world apart if that's what it took to bring him home. So when the moment finally comes, it happens not as some dramatic standoff in an exotic location, but in the stark, cruel contrast of two simultaneous realities, Mariah in handcuffs, and Dominic wrapped safely in the arms of Devon and Abby, who cling to him like he is the only solid thing left in a life that has recently been nothing but shifting ground. The authorities close in, the chase ends, and all the fragile fragments of Mariah's escape plan scatter in the wind. She doesn't get to disappear. She doesn't get to rewrite destiny. The law catches up with her, and the woman who has been running on equal parts love, delusion, and desperation is forced to stop running altogether. While Devon and Abby bury their faces in Dominic's hair, kissing his cheeks, whispering reassurances that he's too young to understand, but will feel in the warmth of their arms, Mariah is patted down, read her rights, and led away, the sound of the child's soft breaths behind her clashing violently with the cold snap of metal closing around her wrists. Whatever she thought she was protecting him from, whatever story she told herself to justify crossing that line, it all fades under the harsh fluorescent light of reality. She took a child who wasn't hers to keep, and now the world expects her to pay for it. But even in that moment, the universe grants her one small mercy, or at least something that looks like mercy in a town where justice is often brutal and unforgiving. Christine Blair Romalotti will step forward as her defense attorney. It's not a popular position to take, representing the woman who stole a baby and terrified half of Genoa City, and Christine knows this. She knows she will be judged, whispered about, second-guessed, painted as the one standing between a mother and her rightful sense of vengeance. But Christine has always understood that the justice system is not supposed to be about who is easiest to hate. It is supposed to be about the truth, in all its messy layers. When she looks at Mariah, she doesn't see a one-dimensional criminal. She sees a woman with a lifetime of trauma, a survivor of manipulation and cult indoctrination, someone who was trusted with an impossible emotional assignment: carry a child, bond with him, and then hand him back as if he were never a part of you. Christine knows that the law will see kidnapping charges, potential enhancements, a case that could easily be pushed to its harshest limit if Abby's rage and public pressure dominate the narrative. Her job is to push back against the urge to turn Mariah into a symbol and insist on seeing her as a person. She will stand in court and argue not that Mariah is blameless, but that punishment without understanding is a hollow victory. She will dig into medical records, psychological evaluations, the long pattern of unhealed wounds that made Mariah vulnerable to breaking in exactly this way. She will try to carve out a space where mental illness, grief, and twisted love are acknowledged as part of the story, not just dismissed as excuses. And in the process, she will force Devin, Abby, and the entire town to confront a painful question: what do we do with someone who has done something unforgivable, not out of pure malice, but out of a mind that was no longer entirely her own? As this legal and emotional storm gathers around Mariah, another Newman is quietly walking toward a different kind of abyss. Nick has always been the good son, in contrast to Adam's more openly self-destructive chaos, the one who seemed to at least try to do the right thing. To stand between the worst of Victor's decisions and the people who might be hurt by them. But lately, that armor has been wearing thin, and the cracks are starting to show in ways that are small at first, but impossible to ignore if you're really paying attention. It starts with pain, physical and emotional, the kind of pain that doctors are very quick to treat with prescriptions, legitimate prescriptions, with Nick's name on the bottle. Dosages neatly printed on the label. At first, he takes them as instructed, more out of obedience than desire. But as his world grows heavier, family scandals, romantic failures, business pressure, the never-ending stress of being a Newman, those little pills become more than just relief for a singular injury. They become a way to soften all the edges of his life at once. He doesn't notice when he starts asking for refills a little sooner than he should, or when he starts spacing the doses closer together than the instructions suggest. He tells himself it's fine. He's Nick Newman. He's not like the people who lose control. He can handle it. Except he doesn't realize how quickly handling it blurs into something else once fentanyl enters the picture. Whether it's mixed into what he's given or whispered into his orbit as an easy upgrade, the temptation is there. Faster relief, more powerful escape, just a little stronger. He knows the word, knows the headlines, the horror stories, the overdoses, the funerals. And still, there's a moment, after one too many bad days, when the thought crosses his mind that maybe just once wouldn't hurt. That maybe he deserves one night without feeling like everything is pressing down on his chest. He hasn't fully crossed that line yet, but the show makes it clear he is walking dangerously close to it, each prescription. Each sidestep of self-awareness pulling him down a path that has claimed countless lives less complicated than his. It is ugly, quiet, insidious, and it is happening not with a dramatic crash, but in the slow, incremental erosion of his boundaries. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Newman universe, Claire is quietly playing a much sharper game, one that has nothing to do with painkillers and everything to do with information, leverage, and revenge. The week is shaping up to be one where she finally gains the upper hand over Audra. And there is a dark satisfaction in watching someone who has been underestimated finally pull back the curtain on a lie others thought they had buried. Claire has been digging, watching, connecting dots that people like Audra and Holden Novak were counting on no one ever bothering to connect. At first, the disappearance of the art gallery owner looked like one more crime in a long list of tragedies that could be blamed on faceless danger. But the more Claire pried, the more the pattern pointed not to randomness, but to orchestration. Audra and Holden weren't just unlucky associates of a man who vanished, they were actively hiding the truth about his death, smoothing over questions, redirecting suspicion, constructing airtight alibis to keep their involvement or knowledge from ever coming to light. When Claire finally uncovers the extent of the cover-up, the falsified statements, the conveniently misplaced evidence, the quiet payoffs, it is like watching a puzzle lock into place. The art dealer didn't simply disappear, he died, and they hid it. Instead of being horrified into silence, Claire sees an opportunity. This is not merely something she knows, it is something she can use. And use it she will. She doesn't rush to the authorities right away. That would be too simple, too quick, and it wouldn't satisfy the part of her that has grown tired of watching people like Audra skate by on charm and manipulation. Instead, she plays with it. She lets Audra squirm. She drops little hints that she knows more than she should, asks questions that go just a bit too close to the truth, watches the way Audra's eyes flicker with fear before she regains her composure. When the timing is right, Claire lays it out, piece by piece, making sure Audra and Holden understand exactly how much she knows and exactly how badly it will destroy them if she decides to hand it over to law enforcement or to the press. She doesn't just want them scared, she wants them broken. She wants Audra to feel the walls closing in, to realize that every slick maneuver and calculated choice has finally caught up with her. Claire's victory is not just about exposing a crime. It is about reclaiming power in a family and a town where she has so often been dismissed or manipulated. As she watches Audra's carefully constructed world begin to tremble, there is a flash of cruelty in her satisfaction, a sense that she is not content to simply win. She wants Audra to suffer, to lie awake at night wondering when the other shoe will drop. And in Genoa City, where secrets are as common as air, that kind of psychological torment can be more devastating than a prison sentence. While all of this plays out across courtrooms, hospitals, and galleries, Kane Ashby is quietly moving toward his own breaking point, his descent less explosive but no less tragic. He has already endured losses that would flatten most people: romantic heartbreaks, professional betrayals. The slow erosion of his sense of self as his best intentions are twisted or erased by the agendas of others. This latest round of chaos, tied to Victor's schemes and the endless tug-of-war over Newman power, has left him hanging by a thread. He thought that aligning himself with Victor, trying to help orchestrate a fake kidnapping or a shock maneuver as part of some larger Newman strategy, was a way to prove his loyalty and secure his family's future. He convinced himself that the end result would justify the ugliness of the means, that once the dust settled, he would be seen as a necessary player rather than a disposable pawn. But when the truth begins to seep through that Lily, his Lily, the woman he has loved and hurt and tried to make amends with, was involved in Victor's fake kidnapping plan, it is like being struck in the gut. It is not just that Victor has used him, or that the whole operation was morally murky. It is that someone he believed was standing outside the worst of Newman games, someone he perhaps saw as a moral compass in a world of flexible ethics, was secretly right in the middle of it. The realization that Lily participated in the setup, that she stood on the other side of a line he thought she would never cross, shatters something inside him that had already been dangerously fragile. It makes all his sacrifices feel not just meaningless, but foolish. He wasn't a partner, he was a shield, a distraction, another piece on the board that Victor and Lily and others could move where they wanted without telling him the full rules of the game. His anger is volcanic, but it is undercut by something even worse, a sense of crushing worthlessness. How many times can a man discover he has been lied to, used, and sidelined before he stops believing he deserves anything better? The cumulative weight of betrayal, from Victor's manipulation to Lily's hidden role, pushes Kane to the edge of a chasm he has spent years trying not to fall into. Fans will watch as his composure slips, as the man who once strutted through boardrooms with cocky confidence now stares blankly at his reflection, barely recognizing the hollow-eyed stranger looking back. Every new blow: Mariah's arrest, the Newman scandals, the business shift stangles together into one inescapable truth for him: he has lost too much, and the ground he's standing on is gone. In the end, this stretch of story on The Young and the Restless is not just about single events: a kidnapping, an arrest, a cover-up, a relapse, a lie revealed. It is about the way those events tear at the internal wiring of the characters who live through them. Mariah, dragged away while the child she loves is reclaimed by his legal parents, is forced to confront the line between love and criminality under the wary protection of Christine, who is determined to keep her from being swallowed whole by a system that doesn't care why she broke, only that she did. Nick is slowly, quietly sliding toward a crisis of his own, one pill at a time, inching closer to an addiction that could blow his life apart, even as he insists he is in control. Claire is seizing her moment, turning the withheld truth about a dead gallery owner into a weapon that allows her to finally outmaneuver Audra and Holden, savoring the pain she inflicts as if it is overdue justice. Kane is collapsing under the weight of too much loss, too many betrayals, and the devastating discovery that even Lily was not standing as far outside Victor's machinations as he had believed. All of them are standing at crossroads they did not choose, and as the week unfolds, it becomes clear that no matter who technically wins or loses in each individual battle, Genoa City itself is sinking deeper into a place where every act of survival comes with a price that someone will eventually have to pay. When the dust of the latest crises starts to settle just enough for people to catch their breath, Nikki is the first to admit that nothing about Victor's so-called plan feels right. Even if she cannot quite bring herself to condemn him with the same sharpness that others might use. As the week winds down, Kane is pacing some invisible groove into the ground with worrying. His anxiety almost a physical presence in every room he enters as he fixates on what Victor has done with Lily and the twins. He is not sleeping properly, not thinking clearly. And the threat he once hurled at Adam about a Newman paying the price if Lily or the kids were hurt now hangs in the air like a curse he might actually be willing to fulfill. Against that tense backdrop, Victor calls Nikki, Victoria, and Adam together to update them about Mariah and the broader fallout rippling through town, and it is in that setting, with tension coiled in everyone's shoulders, that he casually slides in the reassurance that Lily agreed to the fake kidnapping plan. He delivers it as if it is a calming fact, as if the voluntary nature of her involvement somehow cleanses everything that has happened or might still happen. To Victor, the decision was strategic, necessary, a calculated risk meant to protect his empire from threats both external and internal. But to Nikki and Victoria, the words land like stones dropped into already troubled water. Victoria, in particular, bristles instantly. She knows Lily, knows the weight of the Chancellor debacle, knows how deeply Lily was cut by being outmaneuvered and misled in that deal. The idea that this same woman, still smarting from that betrayal, would calmly sign on to another elaborate manipulation spearheaded by Victor does not sit right with her. She doesn't say he is lying, but her doubt is written plainly in the tight line of her mouth and the way her eyes narrow. Replaying recent events and testing his claim against everything she knows about Lily's temperament and pride. Adam, standing on the periphery as always, chooses this moment to drop another log onto the fire by telling Victor he has seen Kane and that the man looked absolutely unhinged. This is more than normal stress, Adam insists. This is panic running close to rage, the kind of frantic intensity that makes a person dangerous because they have nothing left to lose. Adam's tone is not just informative, it is cautionary. He is reminding Victor in his own sideways way of what Kane said the last time they collided, that if Lily or the kids were harmed, someone under the Newman banner would suffer for it. That threat, brushed off at the time as emotional outburst, now circles back with a fiercer edge because the scenario Kane feared has, in his mind, become reality. Even if Lily technically agreed to Victor's plan, Kane wasn't part of that agreement, and his sense of betrayal is no less real. While Victor tries to wave away Adam's concerns with his usual confidence, insisting that he has thought of everything and that Kane, like everyone else, will ultimately fall in line or be neutralized, the unease in the room deepens. Victoria and Nikki exchange glances that say more than their words, silently acknowledging that whatever Victor has set in motion is now moving beyond his ability to fully control. No matter how much he insists otherwise, the more Nikki hears, the less she can reconcile the Victor she loves with the Victor who stages fake kidnappings as if they are strategic chess moves and not traumatic events that leave scars on the people involved. She and Victoria both press him, not just about Lily's supposed consent, but about the actual terms she supposedly agreed to. They want specifics. Did Lily understand the full extent of the plan? Did she know how long it would go on? What risks it posed to her reputation, her children, her marriage? Was she told the real objectives, or only given a sanitized version that made her look like a willing participant in a necessary illusion? Victor, true to form, shuts down any attempt to pry too deeply. He offers broad assurances, but no details, trusting, as he always does, that his family will eventually fall back in line behind him, even when they question him in the moment. The more evasive he becomes, the more it confirms Nikki and Victoria's worst suspicions that he is once again playing God with people's lives, writing roles for them without their full understanding. Assuming their love, loyalty, or desperation will carry them through the fallout. For Victoria, this brushes up against old wounds, times when her father's plans have dragged her into scandals, betrayals, and heartbreak, all in the name of protecting the family legacy. For Nikki, it reopens years of standing by a man whose brilliance has always been shadowed by a frightening capacity to justify the unjustifiable. It is Nikki who finally says aloud what has been simmering under their questions, though she couches it in that weary, conflicted tone that has defined so much of her marriage to Victor. She points out the bitter irony of the moment. While Victor is out here faking kidnappings as part of his convoluted attempts to save his life's work, Dominic, his actual grandchild, is somewhere out there truly kidnapped, in real danger, his parents sick with fear. The contrast is almost obscene. On one side, a calculated performance meant to manipulate outcomes in the corporate arena. On the other, a living, breathing child stolen from his home, his safety in question. The fact that these two realities coexist in the same family, at the same time, is not lost on Nikki. She cannot ignore how wrong it feels that Victor has chosen to play with the imagery of abduction as a business tactic when their family is living through the very real horror of it. And yet, even as she voices this, even as she admits she thinks what he is doing is reckless and morally compromised, she falls back into the familiar pattern of softening the blow. She tells Victoria she understands why Victor is doing it, that he is trying to preserve the empire he built with his own hands, that he is fighting for something that, in his mind, defines his very identity. She does not excuse him, not outright, but she cushions him from the full impact of her disapproval in a way that is heartbreakingly predictable. She has spent years walking this tightrope, seeing the damage, quietly acknowledging the harm, and then sliding back into a role where she contextualizes it, rationalizes it, and ultimately allows it to continue. Victoria, less inclined to indulge her father's worst impulses, pushes harder. She and Nikki dissect Lily's potential motivations in hushed conversations after the fact, wondering if the key to understanding all of this lies not in Victor's persuasive power, but in the complicated tangle of resentment and hurt that Lily carries toward Kane. The Chancellor deal, with all of its deception and leverage, left Lily feeling humiliated and manipulated. Perhaps, they speculate, agreeing to Victor's plan was less about trusting him and more about punishing Kane, or at least distancing herself from him emotionally and strategically. Maybe Lily was angrier at Kane than she was at Victor, angrier at the way he had repeatedly pulled her into impossible choices, and saw Victor's offer as a way to assert some control, even if that control came wrapped in moral compromise. The idea that Lily might have been willing to take part in a fake kidnapping because she resented Kane more than she distrusted Victor is unsettling. But it fits the emotional math that Nikki and Victoria have been quietly running. It turns the whole situation into an even more volatile triangle of hurt feelings and bad decisions, Victor using the situation to protect his company, Lily using it to reclaim some twisted sense of agency, and Kane thinking he is fighting for his family, when in reality, he has been cut out of the loop completely. That, more than anything, fuels Nikki's fear that Kane could be pushed past the point of no return. She remembers his threat clearly, the way his voice shook with barely controlled fury when he warned Adam that a Newman would pay if Lily or the kids got hurt. At the time, it might have sounded like bluster, but combined with his current panic, it now feels like a prophecy waiting to be fulfilled. Nikki voices a worrying that Victoria shares, but doesn't want to say out loud. What if Kane simply decides that he has nothing left to lose and lets everything crash down around them? It would not take much, a single decision to expose every detail of Victor's fake kidnapping plot, a single moment of vindictive clarity, and the entire carefully constructed facade could crumble. Newman Enterprises could face legal scrutiny, public outrage, shareholder revolt. Victor's enemies, both old and new, would seize on the hypocrisy of a man who staged a kidnapping while his own grandchild was truly in danger. Lily's reputation could be shredded, not as a victim, but as a willing co-conspirator. The ripple effects through their already fragile family web could be catastrophic. Nikki imagines it like a row of dominoes that Victor set up in secret, assuming he could always control the way they fall, and now Kane stands at one end, furious, shaking, with the power to send it all toppling with a flick of his hand. As Nikki and Victoria go in circles, weighing their father's intentions against the potential fallout, a grim pattern becomes clear. Victor keeps gambling with human lives in order to protect his empire, and the people around him keep finding ways to half forgive him, half condemn him, and wholly enable him. Nikki tells herself that she is simply trying to understand him, to see the frightened man beneath the swagger. The one who is terrified of losing the company that has become the extension of his very soul. She remembers the nights when he was vulnerable, when he let her see how terrified he was of aging, of irrelevance, of being pushed aside by the very children he raised to be strong. That version of him still tugs at her heart, convincing her that underneath the ruthlessness is a man who truly believes he is doing what must be done to keep everyone afloat. But at the same time, she cannot close her eyes to the reality that each new plan extracts a harsher price, that each crisis he manufactures or escalates leaves the family more fractured, the business more exposed, and their moral center more eroded. In the end, Nikki is left clutching a paradox she has known all her life. Victor is both the reason they have everything and the reason they stand to lose it. Victoria, sharper and more hardened, is less willing to romanticize that paradox. She sees the pattern and knows that at some point, someone in the family will have to decide whether protecting the empire is worth constantly sacrificing their peace, their principles, and their relationships. Watching Kane unravel, knowing Lily has been dragged into the shadows of Victor's strategy, listening to updates about Dominic's very real kidnapping while her father plays games with fake ones. She cannot shake the sense that they are all standing on a cliff edge and that this time, the wind is stronger than Victor is willing to admit. Kane's next move, Victor's next lie, Lily's next decision, Mariah's fate. Dominic's safety, all of it is tangled together in a knot of cause and effect that could easily pull the entire Newman world into freefall. And as much as Nikki wants to believe that they will once again find a way to land on their feet, a small, honest part of her whispers the fear she cannot voice in front of Victor. That this might be the moment when one man's refusal to stop playing God finally costs them everything he was so desperate to protect. By the time Nikki Newman made her way up the familiar path to the Abbott mansion, the sun over Genoa City was already sinking, casting long shadows that matched the quiet ache inside her. The conversation with Victoria earlier had not soothed her. If anything, it had left her more unsettled. Because there is something uniquely terrifying about realizing that your daughter is starting to see your husband the way the rest of the world does. As a powerful man who believes the rules are for other people. All weekend the tension had built. Victor's insistence that Lily had agreed to the fake kidnapping, his cold refusal to share the details, Kane's simmering panic. Dominic actually being missing while Victor played war games with faux abductions. Nikki had gone home, poured herself a drink she told herself she didn't need, stared at the walls of a house that had witnessed decades of their chaos, and realized that if she stayed one more minute inside that gilded cage of secrets, she might shatter. And when Nikki shatters, she doesn't scream, she goes somewhere she can breathe. For better or worse, that place has always been Jack Abbott. The Abbott estate felt like stepping onto another planet, one where the energy was different even when the problems were just as big. Jack opened the door with the expression of a man who knew before she said a word that something was wrong. It was in the way she held herself, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes too bright, mouth set in a thin line that tried and failed to look composed. They didn't need pleasantries. Jack ushered her into the living room. That same room that had nearly become a crime scene of the heart weeks earlier when Victor had walked in on them mid-embrace at the Newman Ranch and nearly exploded. The memory hovered between them, unspoken, but impossible to forget. Victor's fury, his threats, the way Nikki had felt like a child caught doing something unspeakable. Even though all she had done was seek comfort from someone who understood her. Tonight, the roles were reversed. Victor was not there to rage and stomp and stake his claim. Instead, it was Nikki whose world felt out of control, and Jack whose steady presence offered the illusion of safety. She sank onto the couch, and Jack took the chair opposite at first, giving her space, waiting. She began with the surface details: how Victor had told them Lily wasn't on it, how he'd refused to answer questions, how Victoria had doubted every word, how Adam had described Kane as looking like a man about to do something irreversible. Little by little, the words stopped being about events and became about fear. Nikki's voice trembled as she admitted that what terrified her wasn't just what Victor had already done, but the chilling feeling that he was only getting started. She talked about the fake kidnapping of Lily, about how wrong it felt to stage something so traumatic while Dominic was truly missing somewhere in the world, about how the symbolism of it was like a bad omen they were all pretending not to see. She confessed that even as she had confronted Victor, even as she had told him that it was twisted to play with pretend abductions when their grandson was in real danger, she had heard herself slipping back into the role she hated, the wife who explains him, softens him, excuses him because she understands his reasons. She hated that word now, reasons, as if intention were a magic eraser for impact. She looked at Jack with eyes full of shame and asked, almost in a whisper, Whether he thought there was something broken in her that she still could not fully walk away from a man who kept crossing lines, again and again, even as she watched the cost rise around them. Jack listened, really listened, the way Victor never did unless he could weaponize what was said later. There was no deal on the table here, no angle. He wasn't trying to pull Nikki away from Victor for sport, the way he might have in younger, pettier days. He was simply sitting in front of a woman he had loved in more than one lifetime, watching her wrestle with the possibility that love might not be enough to survive the newest version of Victor's madness. Eventually, the confession she had really come to make slipped out, raw and vulnerable. "What if he goes too far this time, Jack?" she asked, voice barely louder than a breath. "So far that I can't live with it. What if there's a line he finally crosses and I realize I can't follow him anymore?" It was not a question she could ever ask Victor. He would hear it as a threat, an ultimatum, a betrayal. Jack heard it as what it truly was, a woman wondering how much of herself she was willing to lose in order to keep being Mrs. Victor Newman. His answer was not a declaration or a demand. He didn't say leave him or stay with him. Instead, he told her, gently, that there had always been a line, whether she wanted to acknowledge it or not, and that maybe the reason she was here was because, deep down, she could feel that line under her feet now more than ever. He reminded her, not maliciously but quietly, how many times she had cleaned up Victor's messes, endured public humiliation, made peace with things she swore she never would. All in the name of family. He said he could see how much she loved Victor, but he could also see how tired she was. Really tired, not long day tired, but soul tired. The kind of tired that comes from spending a lifetime translating a man's cruelty into protection. And as he spoke, he could see the tension in her shoulders start to shake, like his words had finally given her permission to feel the exhaustion she'd been holding back. Nikki's composure cracked then, not in a dramatic collapse, but in small, broken pieces. She pressed her hands over her face for a moment, then dropped them, eyes wet, and admitted that sometimes she was more afraid of who she turned into around Victor than of Victor himself. She talked about the desperation she saw in Kane, the rage building there, the way the whole city felt like a powder keg waiting for a spark. She confessed she had no idea how she would survive it if Victor's schemes were the reason everything finally blew. The words came faster, tumbling over each other, until it became clear that what she needed wasn't more analysis or strategy. She needed, selfishly and simply, to not be alone. Jack moved without fanfare. He left the chair and came to sit beside her on the couch, the way he had countless times in the past when her world had been falling apart. He didn't overwhelm her, didn't drag her into an embrace she didn't ask for. He just placed a hand lightly over hers first, giving her a chance to pull away if she wanted to. She didn't. Instead, she turned toward him, and that small movement was all the permission he needed to wrap his arms around her, drawing her into his chest as if he could physically absorb some of the weight she was carrying. She leaned into him, the way a weary person leans into a wall when their legs threaten to give. For a few long moments, the room felt suspended in time. No Victor, no Lily, no fake kidnappings, no Dominic missing. No corporate wars, just two people with decades of history sitting in the wreckage of choices that never stopped echoing. Of course, Genoa City doesn't allow quiet moments to stay quiet for long. Just as Nikki's breathing finally began to slow and Jack's hand moved soothingly up and down her back in that old, familiar pattern, footsteps sounded in the hallway. Neither of them noticed at first. Nikki was hidden against Jack's shoulder, and Jack's focus was entirely on steadying the emotionally fragile woman in his arms, but the doorway did not remain empty. Diane Jenkins Abbott appeared there, mid-step, mid-thought, and froze as the scene in front of her came into focus, her husband seated on the couch, his arms wrapped around his ex-wife. Their bodies close in a way that no amount of "we're just friends" could easily explain away. The expression that flashed across Diane's face was fierce and immediate, a mix of hurt, fury, and bitter vindication. This was exactly what she had told Jack she feared, exactly the boundary she had warned him about. Just a week ago, she had looked him straight in the eye and admitted that she hated his intimacy with Nikki almost as much as Victor did, that every lingering touch, every private conversation, every whispered reassurance chipped away at the security she had fought tooth and nail to rebuild with him. She had asked him, very clearly, to respect that. To remember that loyalty is not just about who you sleep with, but about who you run to when your heart is in pieces. And here he was, arms around Nikki again, while Diane stood in the doorway, watching the past wrap itself around her present. For Diane, this moment wasn't just about what she was seeing, it was about everything she had feared people would always think, that she was the second choice, the consolation prize. The woman Jack settled down with because he couldn't have the one he truly loved. Seeing Nikki buried in Jack's arms, seeing his face softened with concern and tenderness, tore open that old insecurity with savage force. The air in the room changed instantly, heavy with the awareness that they had been caught. Jack felt at first that electric prickle of being watched. He looked up and saw Diane standing there, her eyes wide and hard at the same time, her mouth pressed into a line that was one sharp word away from breaking into an accusation. Nikki pulled back slightly, following his gaze, and when she turned and saw Diane as well, a flush of shame crept up her neck. Not because anything inappropriate in the literal sense had happened, there had been no kiss, no confession of forbidden love, but because she knew exactly how it looked. And exactly how little that distinction would matter to a woman like Diane. In that single, charged moment, all the warnings from last week snapped back into focus. Diane telling Jack she hated his closeness with Nikki. Jack promising, or at least implying, that he could manage it, that he could draw lines, that he knew what he was doing. The warning had been clear. Don't put me in a position where I have to watch you choose her emotional crises over our peace, and yet, here they were. Jack was not the same man who had once chased Nikki as a romantic conquest, and his feelings for Diane were not some flimsy thing he could brush aside. But he had underestimated, again, how much it would cost to be Nikki's safe harbor in a world where she was married to Victor and he was married to Diane. He had believed, perhaps naively, that he could be just a friend to Nikki in public and private without it slicing into his current marriage. Diane, standing in the doorway, saw none of the nuance, none of the history, none of the internal justification. She saw only confirmation of her worst fear, that when Nikki is hurting, Jack will always open his arms, and when Jack opens his arms, Nikki will always walk into them.